5 cases, 5 investigations that shook the systems meant to protect the most vulnerable among us. Some made headlines for weeks. Others faded from public memory. Until now. In the next 2 hours, we're going back through each of these cases in detail. The timeline, the investigation, the evidence that cracked them open, and in some cases, the questions that still remain unanswered. This isn't just true crime. This is about understanding how these cases unfolded, what the system got right, what it got wrong, and what changed because of them. We'll go case by case in full detail, so stay with us till the end. Because case number 4 involves a twist in the investigation that even the investigating officers didn't see coming. Let's begin. Picture this. A 13-year-old girl locked in the back seat of a car on a South Carolina summer day so brutal that the heat index climbed past 97 degrees. Her skin already blistering, her diaper soiled, the windows sealed, the air completely still, and the temperature inside that vehicle climbing, all the way to 135 degrees Fahrenheit. She could not speak. She could not move her legs. She could not unbuckle her own seatbelt. She could not push open the door. She could not cry out for help. She could do absolutely nothing except sit there in silence, in agony, and wait for someone to come. And the person who was supposed to come was just a few feet away inside a house, getting high on methamphetamine. 5 hours and 42 minutes. That is how long Cristina Pangalangan was left to die in that car. And the worst part, the part that will stay with you long after this ends, is that this didn't come from nowhere. There were warnings, there were formal reports, there were government agencies specifically designed to protect children exactly like Cristina. And every single layer of protection failed, one by one, year after year. This is not just a story about a mother and her boyfriend. This is a story about what happens when a system built to protect the most vulnerable people on Earth decides to look the other way. This is a story about 5 complaints that went nowhere, about burns that went untreated, and about a little girl who couldn't speak a single word in her entire life, and therefore couldn't tell anyone what was being done to her. This is the story of Cristina Ann Pangalangan. Cristina was born on April 18, 2006 in South Carolina, the youngest of 3 sisters. From the very first days of her life, doctors delivered difficult news. Cristina was diagnosed at birth with cerebral palsy, a neurological condition affecting the brain's control over movement and posture that does not go away. For Cristina, it was severe. Over time, she also received diagnoses of epilepsy and scoliosis, requiring daily medication to manage her symptoms. She was non-verbal, meaning she never learned to use words. Not one. Not in her entire 13 years of life. She used a wheelchair and depended entirely on others for every physical need. Bathing, dressing, eating, everything. On paper, that sounds like a life defined by limitation. But everyone who actually knew Cristina will tell you something completely different. This girl had personality in spades. She watched SpongeBob SquarePants and Dora the Explorer with an obsessive devotion that her family loved, sitting through the same episodes on repeat, her face lighting up the exact same way every single time. She loved water. Swimming gave her a freedom that her wheelchair simply couldn't. She attended Colleton County Middle School and she thrived there, not because academics were the point, but because Cristina loved people. She loved being seen. She loved being included. She communicated entirely through facial expression, and she was extraordinarily fluent in it. Joy, frustration, stubbornness, mischief, all of it playing out across her face in ways that made people stop and really look at her. She was funny. She was strong-willed. She was, by every account, deeply loved by those who took the time to know her. Her mother was Rita Pangalangan, and by every professional measure, Rita was a respected woman. She had spent more than 25 years in education, teaching at Colleton County Middle School, the same district where Cristina attended school. In 2014, Rita was named Teacher of the Year. She was involved in community organizations supporting people with disabilities. She presented herself as a devoted caregiver, a woman who had taken on the extraordinary challenge of raising a severely disabled child. Rita often said that God had made her Cristina's mother because she was strong enough to handle it. The truth, it turned out, was something very different. When Cristina's parents separated, Rita became her sole legal guardian. Cristina's father, Larry Pangalangan, lived in another state, and the older sisters had largely moved on. It was essentially Rita and Cristina, a caregiver and a child who required constant around-the-clock supervision. The first cracks appeared in 2016 when the South Carolina Department of Social Services, SCDSS, received its very first formal complaint about Rita Pangalangan. The allegation was specific. Rita was not providing adequate care, supervision, or medical attention to her disabled daughter. SCDSS opened an investigation, and then essentially nothing changed. By 2018, Rita had begun a romantic relationship with Larry Eugene King Jr, a man from Ruffin, a small community about 30 miles outside of Walterboro. King had a prior history involving domestic violence and drug-related charges, and he quickly became a constant presence around Cristina. The complaints to SCDSS kept coming. One in 2016, then another, but none of them produced any meaningful action. The fifth and final complaint arrived in March 2019, 5 months before Cristina would die, and this one was impossible to dismiss. Cristina came to school one morning with burns covering her face, her neck, and her chest. Not minor burns, severe, visible, untreated burns, the kind that stop everyone in a building cold. The wounds appeared infected. There were no bandages, no sign of any medical treatment whatsoever. The injuries were open and inflamed, and from them came a smell suggesting infection spreading beneath the surface. When school officials contacted Rita, she had an explanation ready. Cristina had accidentally spilled hot water on herself while asleep. An accident, she said, nothing more. The school urged her to seek immediate medical attention. The next day, Cristina returned to school with the same wounds. No treatment, no doctor's note, nothing confirming anything had been addressed. The Colleton County School District contacted SCDSS again. Rita's response to these repeated reports was not gratitude. It was irritation. She told social workers she was exhausted by the school's constant complaints, and then she said something that reveals her state of mind more clearly than anything else. If the reports didn't stop, she would pull Cristina out of school entirely. She was willing to deny her profoundly disabled daughter one of the few consistent sources of joy in her life, just to make the oversight stop. And despite all of this, 5 separate complaints over 3 years, including one involving visible, untreated burns on a child's face, SCDSS did not remove Cristina from the home. There was no emergency intervention. There was no escalation. Cristina stayed where she was. More people were beginning to notice things too. Brittany Honeycutt, who rented a room in the Pangalangan home in the summer of 2019, testified at trial that Rita repeatedly asked her to watch Cristina with very little notice. When Honeycutt said she couldn't one particular day because she had to go to work, Rita didn't accept that. According to testimony, Rita told her to just put Cristina in the car with the windows cracked, because she did it all the time. That phrase, "I do it all the time," would take on devastating weight in the months that followed. By August 2019, Cristina was 13 years old, about to start 8th grade, still watching SpongeBob, still smiling, still herself. On Friday evening, August 2nd, 2019, Rita needed someone to watch her daughter, and she called Lindsay Lewis. Lindsay was 18 years old, not a trained caregiver, and had been Rita's student in a child development course. Lindsay dreamed of becoming a nurse, and Rita knew it. "This will be good experience for your future," Rita told her. "This will help you." It was a calculated pitch aimed at someone young and eager. Lindsay said yes. When she arrived and met Cristina for the first time, she immediately understood the full scope of care involved. Cristina couldn't speak, couldn't walk unaided, couldn't feed herself, couldn't manage anything independently. Rita gave Lindsay detailed instructions, made sure she had Cristina's nutritional drinks, and then asked if she could step out for just a few hours. She had a date with Larry. Lindsay agreed. A few hours she could handle. Rita left. That evening, Rita sent a text checking on Cristina, and then, almost as an afterthought, added that she would be back the next day. Saturday came. No Rita, no calls, no updates. Saturday night, nothing. Lindsay was 18 years old, alone in a house she had never been in before, caring for a severely disabled child she had met the previous evening. There was almost no food in the refrigerator. The only provisions were Cristina's nutritional drinks. There were no emergency contact numbers, no backup plan, nothing. And then Lindsay noticed something else. The house was thoroughly, visibly infested with bed bugs. This was the home of a school teacher, a woman named Teacher of the Year. Rita didn't return that night or the next morning. On Sunday, she finally sent a message. Larry had food poisoning, she said. She didn't know how to drive his truck. She was just waiting. She returned Sunday evening. Lindsay heard a car pull up with music pounding from the speakers. Rita walked in, gathered Cristina, and left. Lindsay had survived nearly 48 hours in a situation she should never have been placed in. But for Cristina, Sunday evening was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of the last day of her life. The following morning, Monday, August 5th, 2019, Rita drove Cristina to Larry King's property off Low Country Highway in Colton County, a rural stretch outside Ruffin, about 30 miles from Walterboro. The property had a house, a driveway, and a security camera system that recorded time-stamped footage of everything that happened outside. That camera would become the most important witness in this entire case. At approximately 11 in the morning, Larry Eugene King Jr. placed Cristina Pangalangan into the back seat of Rita's 2012 Volkswagen Jetta. The car sat fully exposed in the driveway. No shade, no trees, no shelter of any kind. The South Carolina August sun bore down directly. The engine was off, the air conditioning did not run. The windows were closed. Cristina was strapped in, unable to release her own seatbelt, unable to open a door, unable to call for anyone. She wore a diaper she could not change herself. And Rita and Larry went inside the house. Court testimony established that both of them had been using methamphetamine, not just that day, but for multiple days before August 5th. When investigators drew blood from both of them that afternoon, tests came back positive for meth. A forensic toxicologist testified the drug was active in their systems. These were not functioning caregivers. They were under the influence of a powerful stimulant, and they had left a helpless, non-verbal, wheelchair-bound child sealed inside a metal vehicle in the full blaze of a South Carolina summer. The outside temperature reached 91 degrees Fahrenheit with a heat index of 97. Inside the Jetta, parked in direct sunlight with zero air movement, the temperature climbed relentlessly. According to climatology expert Andrew Grunstein, the heat inside that vehicle reached 135 degrees Fahrenheit, 57 degrees Celsius, the temperature of a steam oven, the temperature at which skin blisters on contact. The security footage recorded everything with merciless precision. Rita and Larry came outside periodically. They argued. They sat on the porch swing. They went back inside. They walked near the car. They returned to the house. The footage showed them again and again within feet of that vehicle, fully aware it was there, choosing over and over to go back inside. At around the 1 hour mark, they checked on Cristina once, then went back inside. Another hour passed. Another. Near the 4 hour mark, Rita and Larry realized the car was locked and the keys were inside, with Cristina. They tried to break in themselves and couldn't. They got into Larry's pickup truck and drove to Rita's house in Walterboro to get a spare key. That round trip took roughly another hour. When they returned and finally unlocked the Jetta, Cristina Pangalangan had been locked inside that car for 5 hours and 42 minutes. They pulled her out. She was not breathing. She was completely unresponsive. Her skin showed the catastrophic signs of hypothermia. Her body was blistered. She was still wearing a soiled diaper. Someone called 911. Emergency responders arrived. There was nothing to be done. No resuscitation, no intervention. Nothing could reverse what 5 hours in a 135-degree car had done to a 13-year-old who couldn't even crack a window. Cristina Pangalangan was pronounced dead at the scene. She was 13 years old, and she had never once spoken a single word. When first responders arrived, Rita told them it had only been a few minutes. She said she had run inside to grab cigarettes, came back out, found the car locked with the keys inside. Just a few minutes, she said. The security camera told a completely different story. Rita Pangalangan and Larry Eugene King Jr. were arrested the same day Cristina, both charged with murder, criminal conspiracy, and rape of a child. 1 week later, in a deeply disturbing echo, Cristina's older sister Ashley Pangalangan, then 30 years old, was arrested for unlawful neglect of a child. Ashley had left 2 young children unattended in a vehicle in Walterboro in 91-degree heat. Officers found the car outside a store, the children inside. Ashley was inside the store, and when she emerged, approximately 15 to 20 minutes after police arrived, she claimed she had only been in the store for 5 minutes. Security footage contradicted her. She posted $25,000 bond and was released. 3 members of the same family, the same pattern, the same disregard. Cristina's funeral was held on August 14, 2019, at Faith Church in Walterboro. Her family asked that in lieu of flowers, donations be made to the Colleton County Special Olympics, the program that had given Cristina some of her greatest moments of joy. In August 2021, a wrongful death lawsuit was filed on behalf of Cristina's estate against SCDSS, citing 5 formal complaints over 3 years, including the March 2019 report about her untreated burns, and alleging the agency had abandoned its legal duty to protect a child who could not protect herself. A second lawsuit followed in August 2022. The criminal trial did not begin until August 2023, 4 years after Cristina's death. The trial was held in Colleton County before Circuit Court Judge Clifton Newman, with Solicitor Duffy Stone and Deputy Solicitor Sean Thornton prosecuting for the state. From day one, the prosecution was direct. This was not an accident, this was murder. The surveillance footage obliterated any claim of forgetfulness. It showed the couple moving around outside, aware of the car, choosing repeatedly not to intervene. They had every opportunity. They made choices. Solicitor Stone's closing argument contained the line that defined the entire trial. She can't scream and she can't talk, but she can show emotion. He described what Cristina's final hours must have looked like, a tortuous death of extreme pain and suffering endured in complete silence. And he asked the jury to hold accountable the people who put her there. The defense argued that Larry King genuinely believed the car was running when he placed Cristina inside and thought the air conditioning was on. Without malice, his attorney argued, there was no murder under South Carolina law. King himself testified that the engine was running when he put Cristina in the back seat and that he didn't realize it had been turned off. Rita Pangalangan did not testify. Her daughter Elizabeth Clyde took the stand in her mother's defense, and through tears described a mother who loved Cristina fiercely, who often said God created her to be Cristina's mother because she was tough enough to handle it. But the surveillance footage existed. The toxicology results existed. The 5 years of DSS complaints existed. The blistered skin and the soiled diaper and the 135-degree car existed. After more than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts for both defendants on murder and great bodily harm. When Judge Newman sentenced Rita to 37 years in prison, she gasped, "Oh my God," and doubled forward, shaking with sobs. Larry King received 32 years. Judge Newman addressed both without softening a word. He said they had tortured and abandoned Cristina time and time again, shown no remorse and no empathy for a child who could not protect herself, and he gave them the harshest sentence the law permitted. The criminal verdicts were not the end of the legal story. In November 2024, a proposed settlement was reached in the civil lawsuit against SCDSS, totaling $314,005.82, with $195,000 expected to come directly from the Department of Social Services, the agency that received 5 reports about Cristina and did not act. The case also produced legislative change. In early 2024, South Carolina legislators began advancing a bill to raise the age limit under the state's homicide by child abuse statute, directly inspired by the legal obstacles prosecutors faced in this trial. Solicitor Stone testified before the legislature that existing law had made the murder convictions difficult to secure, and the bill was designed to close that gap. In January 2026, the South Carolina Court of Appeals denied Larry King's appeal. His conviction was upheld in full. Rita Pangalangan remains in prison serving her 37-year sentence. She was in her late 40s at sentencing. She will be well into her 80s before any release becomes possible. And Cristina is gone. The Colleton County Special Olympics still accepts donations in her name, which is exactly what her family asked for at her funeral. Not flowers, but contributions to the program that gave her some of her happiest moments. She was the 19th child in South Carolina to die of heat stroke in a vehicle since 1998, and her case fell into one of the rarest categories in the state's documented history. A child intentionally left in a car by the very person responsible for keeping her alive. She was not forgotten. She was put there. And the fact that people reported it, that 5 formal complaints were filed, that a little girl arrived at school covered in burns and was sent home to the person who burned her, that teachers and social workers and neighbours all saw the signs, means we lost her, is not quite the right way to say it. We let her go. The school tried to be her voice 5 times. The state agency did not listen. And a little girl who spent her entire life communicating joy and stubbornness and love through nothing but her face, who never once asked for anything with words because she simply didn't have them, died alone in a locked car, baking in the South Carolina heat, while the people who were supposed to love her were inside a house just a few feet away. The least any of us can do is say her name, Cristina Ann Pangalangan, born April 18, 2006, died August 5, 2019, 13 years old. She never said a word, but she had everything to say. She had a funeral. Flowers, a minute of silence, a father who could barely stand upright at the graveside of a daughter whose body was never actually in the ground, because there was no body, there never had been, and 2 kilometers away, in a rented house with the curtains nailed shut, the girl they were mourning was folding laundry. For almost 5 years, an entire country searched for a face that stared out from milk cartons, telephone poles, and the 6 o'clock news. Police dogs tore through mango orchards. Divers dragged ponds near the airport. A convicted killer sat in an interrogation room and described in stomach-turning detail exactly how he said he'd murdered her, down to the tree he claimed he'd buried her under. A judge accepted it. A family accepted it. A nation accepted it. Then, on the 12th day of that killer's murder trial, with the whole courtroom braced for the final grim chapter of a 5-year nightmare, a prosecutor stood up and said something that had never been said in an Australian courtroom before, and hasn't been said since. He said the victim was alive. He said she was fine. And he said the man on trial for her murder, who had confessed to it in his own words on tape, hadn't killed her at all. This is the story of Natasha Ryan, the girl who sat in the gallery of her own murder trial. Natasha Ann Ryan was born on May 9, 1984, in Rockhampton, a mid-sized city on the Fitzroy River in central Queensland that locals call Rocky. It's the kind of town where everybody more or less knows everybody else's business. Cattle country, Tropic of Capricorn heat, the sort of place where a missing teenager becomes the only thing anyone talks about at the supermarket checkout for years. She grew up with her parents, Robert and Jenny, and an older brother. By all early accounts, she was an easy child, sweet, sharp, affectionate. Her father called her Grasshopper because as a toddler she didn't so much walk as bounce, hopping from one spot to the next instead of crawling like other babies. It's a small detail, but it's the kind that makes the word victim feel too small and too cold for the person it's supposedly describing. That gentleness didn't last through her teenage years. Somewhere around the time her parents' marriage began falling apart, Natasha changed. The obedient, giggling girl gave way to truancy, suspensions from school, grades in freefall. She started smoking marijuana and dating men considerably older than she was, relationships her parents fought hard against and lost every time. She ran away from home more than once. And most painfully for the people who loved her, she began hurting herself, a pattern nobody around her could fully explain, then or since. By the time she was 14, In the middle months of 1998, Natasha was seeing a 22-year-old milk delivery driver named Scott Black. Her parents despised the relationship on sight. In July that year, Scott helped her run away from home for 2 days. She was found at an outdoor music event in Rockhampton, having stayed with him at a hotel. Police initially arrested Scott on suspicion of abduction, though the charge didn't stick. He was later fined for obstructing the investigation, after admitting he'd lied to officers about knowing where she was. Natasha came home and promised her mother, Jenny, she'd never run again. For a few weeks, it even seemed to be working. Jenny started driving her to school personally every morning, keeping her close, trying to pull her back from Scott's orbit. Things, briefly, felt like they were healing. Then came the 31st of August. Jenny Ryan dropped her daughter off outside North Rockhampton State High School that morning, the way she had every morning for weeks. Natasha walked toward the gates. Jenny drove away, expecting nothing more remarkable than what any ordinary Monday brings. Just before noon, the phone rang. It was the school. Natasha's name wasn't on the roll. No teacher had seen her in the yard or the corridors. She hadn't signed in anywhere. She simply wasn't there, hadn't been there all morning, as far as anyone could tell. Jenny was confused, then frightened. She'd watched her daughter walk through those gates herself. The family's first move was to search on their own. Given Natasha's history, their minds went straight to Scott Black. Jenny drove to his address, hoping, almost expecting, to find her daughter there again, safe, sullen, maybe angry at being tracked down. Instead, Scott told her he hadn't seen Natasha all day and had no idea where she was. With no other leads, the family went to the police. But because of Natasha's track record, the running away, the recent disappearance with Scott just weeks before, investigators didn't immediately treat it as an abduction. To them, at first glance, this looked like a repeat performance, a rebellious teenager doing what she'd already done once that summer. Detectives brought Scott in for questioning regardless. This time, his account held up cleanly. He'd been out on his milk delivery round that morning with a co-worker who could vouch for every stop he'd made. His alibi was airtight. But an airtight alibi for Scott didn't answer the only question that actually mattered. Where was Natasha? As hours became days with no sign of her, the runaway theory started to wobble. Search parties, police, volunteers, family, friends, combed bushland, walking trails, vacant lots, and the scrubby hill country ringing the city. Her photograph went up everywhere a photograph could go. A few days later, new sightings only deepened the confusion. Several witnesses said they'd seen Natasha on September 2nd, 2 days after she was reported missing, smoking a cigarette and chatting outside a local cinema, apparently with an older man among the group. Friends who'd been with her that day confirmed it was really her, but said she'd given no hint of where she was heading, no mention of running, nothing. After that afternoon outside the cinema, nobody who knew Natasha Ryan ever reported seeing her again. For her family, it was agonizing. Every new detail felt like it should crack the case wide open, and instead only muddied it further. What had looked, at first, like just another teenage escape act was curdling into something far darker, and it was about to get much worse. As the weeks stretched into months without a single solid lead, Rockhampton was gripped by something bigger than one missing girl's case. Between the last months of 1998 and the early months of 1999, a string of disappearances hit the region. Women of wildly different ages and circumstances, vanishing under eerily similar conditions. In December 1998, 39-year-old Julie Turner disappeared after a night out with friends. In March 1999, 37-year-old Beverly Lego was last seen. In April, 19-year-old Sylvia Benedetti went missing. And in that same month came the disappearance that turned quiet dread into open panic across the whole city. 9-year-old Kira Steinhardt vanished in broad daylight, snatched off a footpath in view of another child who witnessed the abduction. Rockhampton effectively shut down after dark. Locals stopped going out at night. Parents wouldn't let their kids walk to the cinema alone. A once easygoing regional city had turned into a place where people locked their doors before sundown and watched the news with their hearts in their throats. Investigators eventually connected all 4 disappearances to one man. Leonard John Fraser, a 50-something labourer with an already horrifying criminal history stretching back to his teenage years, including 2 separate long stretches in prison for rape before he ever reached Rockhampton. He would go on to be branded the Rockhampton rapist in the Australian press, and detectives leading the Joint Task Force didn't mince words about what they were dealing with, a man with every hallmark of a serial predator. DNA evidence tied Fraser conclusively to Kira Steinhardt's murder and to the deaths of the missing women whose remains were subsequently recovered. Police now had a monster in custody. What they didn't have, not yet, was Natasha Ryan. But given the timeline, the location and everything else surfacing about this man, it didn't take long for a horrifying question to take hold across the task force and the town alike. Had Natasha been one of his victims too? When investigators sat down with Leonard Fraser in custody, the case took a turn that would define it for the next 4 years. Fraser didn't just admit to the murders police already suspected him of. He told them he'd killed Natasha Ryan as well. His account was chillingly specific. He claimed he'd picked her up hitchhiking toward the coast, struck her while she slept, assaulted her, and then killed her. He told police he'd disposed of her body near a pink lily pond, not far from the local airport, though in some versions of his account he pointed toward burying her beneath a mango tree, and he was never able to lead searchers to a precise, verifiable location for her remains, no matter how many times they went back over the ground with him. His confession wasn't standing alone either. 2 witnesses independently told police they believed they'd seen Natasha in Fraser's company around the time of her disappearance. Testimony that, however shaky it may have looked in hindsight, gave his account a second layer of apparent credibility at the time. No body, no physical crime scene, no forensic proof tying Fraser to Natasha specifically, the way DNA had tied him to his other victims. Just a confession matched loosely to 2 witness accounts. And yet, for the police and for the grieving public, it was enough. The pieces seemed to lock together. A serial predator was already confirmed to be operating in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, and here he was, describing her death in his own words. The theory that Natasha had simply run away quietly died. In its place rose a far grimmer certainty. She had been murdered, and everyone finally understood, or believed they understood, by whom. By 2001, with no remains recovered and no new leads surfacing, the Ryan family made the decision that had been circling them for months to declare Natasha legally dead. They chose May 9, 2001, the date she would have turned 17, to hold a small memorial service in her honour. Family and friends gathered. There was a minute of silence. For Robert and Jenny, it wasn't closure exactly, but it was an ending of sorts, an acknowledgement, after years of unbearable limbo, that the daughter they'd raised was gone and wasn't coming home. The toll on the family didn't stop with the memorial. Robert and Jenny's marriage, already strained, ultimately ended in divorce. The years of anguish, false hope and grief simply too much for the relationship to bear. Natasha's older brother carried his own private weight. The particular horror of losing a sibling with nothing to bury, no body to grieve over, only a courtroom's worth of second-hand testimony from her presumed killer. Meanwhile, the legal machinery around Leonard Fraser kept grinding forward. His trial for the murders of Beverly Lego, Sylvia Benedetti, Julie Turner and Kira Steinhardt formally opened in 2003, laying bare in devastating detail the extent of what he'd done. His guilt for those four was never seriously in doubt. The forensic case against him was airtight. Natasha's case was the one exception, the only charge on the docket resting purely on a confession and second-hand sightings, with nothing physical to anchor it. Still, in the eyes of the public and a family who had already buried her, Natasha Ryan wasn't a mystery anymore. She was one of Leonard Fraser's victims. Full stop. Nobody, not the prosecution, the defense, or the grieving family in the gallery, had any idea the story was about to detonate. On April 11, 2003, 12 days into Fraser's murder trial, the courtroom sat down expecting more of the same grim procedural rhythm that had defined the previous 11. Instead, the prosecutor rose to speak with an expression that immediately told everyone in the room something was wrong, or, as it would turn out, something almost unimaginably right. He announced that there was news about Natasha Ryan. For one beat, hope and dread collided in the gallery. Many assumed this meant remains had finally been located, that forensic evidence would confirm what everyone already believed and let the family finally, properly bury their daughter. What came next stunned the courtroom into silence. The prosecutor said Natasha Ryan was alive, that she was in good health, and that, as a direct consequence, Leonard Fraser could not stand trial for murdering a woman who was not, in fact, dead. Chaos and disbelief swept the room instantly. Reporters, lawyers and family members sat frozen, unable to process what they'd just heard. Robert Ryan, Natasha's father, present in court that day, collapsed on the spot. For nearly 5 years, he had lived with the absolute conviction that his daughter had been brutally murdered. Now he was being told, in the space of a single sentence, that it had all been untrue. Even Leonard Fraser himself reportedly sat back in his chair, took off his glasses, and wept. The prosecutor explained how the truth had surfaced. Weeks earlier, a caller using the name Sally had phoned a children's counselling helpline, describing herself as a runaway living with her boyfriend, and mentioning almost in passing that a man was about to stand trial for her murder. The counsellor, unable to shake the strangeness of the call, relayed it anonymously to police, though the call couldn't be traced. Shortly after, police received something far more concrete, an unsigned letter containing a street address and phone number, insisting Natasha Ryan was alive and could be found there. When detectives ran down the details, both traced directly back to Scott Black, the boyfriend Natasha had been dating when she vanished 5 years earlier. Police staked out the property quietly for several days, watching for any sign of confirmation before making a move. Then, on the evening of April 10, 2003, officers forced their way into a rented house on Mills Avenue in North Rockhampton, barely 2 kilometers from Natasha's mother's home. What they found inside stopped even hardened investigators cold. Hiding inside a bedroom cupboard was a young woman, pale from years without real sunlight, visibly shaken and unmistakably, undeniably alive. Natasha Ryan had been there the entire time. With Natasha found, the courtroom drama shifted entirely. Fraser's confession to her murder was immediately and automatically nullified. You cannot be guilty of killing someone who is standing, breathing, blinking in the daylight for the first time in years. The case instantly became one of the strangest chapters in Australian legal history. A murder trial derailed not by a legal technicality, but by the supposed victim simply turning up. The girl the whole country had mourned, eulogized, and formally declared dead had in fact been alive the entire time, hidden less than a mile and a half from her own mother's front door. In the days that followed, Natasha had to explain how she had managed to stay hidden for nearly 5 years, without anyone besides Scott Black ever finding out. She was 18, 19 by some accounts, in good physical health, well-fed, and showing no signs of abuse or mistreatment. That alone told investigators what this really was. Not a kidnapping, not a captivity situation, but a decision, a choice she'd made, and then found herself trapped inside. Natasha explained she had simply planned to run away again, something she'd already done once that same year, and had never imagined it would spiral into a nationwide search. As her face started appearing constantly on the news, her fear of coming forward grew right alongside it. The longer she stayed hidden, the more impossible surfacing seemed. That fear, more than anything else, was what kept her in the shadows for the better part of 5 years. For the first stretch of that time, Natasha and Scott weren't even living in the house where she'd eventually be discovered. They'd holed up in a more isolated property near the coast, which gave Natasha at least some freedom of movement without drawing attention. But when Scott's work relocated him to a more built-up, populated part of Rockhampton, everything changed. That's when Natasha's isolation became close to total. The house on Mills Avenue was arranged deliberately to keep her invisible. Heavy curtains stayed drawn across every window. Many never opened at all. Natasha avoided daylight almost entirely. Most of her waking hours were spent inside that bedroom cupboard, the same one where police eventually found her, which she'd retreat to instantly whenever anyone so much as knocked at the door. Scott handled everything from the outside world, groceries, clothes, anything she needed, so she'd never have to risk being seen buying so much as a loaf of bread. At night, once the street had gone quiet, she would sometimes slip out into the backyard, moving carefully in the dark, aware that even a fleeting glimpse from a neighbour was a risk she couldn't control. To anyone who might have spotted her, she would have registered as nothing more than a shape in the dark, a shadow easily dismissed. And in that way, night after night, year after year, an entire nation searched for a girl who was quietly existing 2 kilometers from where the search had started, while her family mourned her at an empty grave. The revelation that Natasha Ryan was alive triggered an immediate wave of conflicting emotion across Australia. Her family was engulfed by an almost impossible mixture of relief, disbelief and confusion, trying to reconcile 5 years of grief with the sudden return of the person they'd mourned. Much of the wider public, though, reacted with real, sustained anger. For nearly 5 years, the search had consumed enormous police resources, mobilised armies of volunteers, and dominated national headlines, all while the person at the centre of it was, by choice, in hiding. Officials later estimated the total cost of the search at more than $500,000, a figure that only deepened public outrage. Critics were blunt. That money and manpower could have gone toward real missing persons cases or public services that badly needed the funding. Natasha's public image flipped almost overnight. The girl, once mourned as the presumed victim of a serial killer, was suddenly recast in a huge swathe of public opinion as someone who had knowingly let an entire country believe a lie for years. Legally, both Natasha and Scott Black faced consequences, though they landed very unevenly. Scott bore the heavier burden. In 2005, Rockhampton District Court found him guilty of interfering with the course of justice, having knowingly hidden Natasha and let a massive resource-draining investigation run its course while sitting on the truth the entire time. He was sentenced to 3 years, with parts suspended, and served roughly a year before release, along with fines that included a contribution toward the cost of the investigation his silence had helped prolong. Natasha's sentence was markedly lighter. In 2006, she was convicted of causing a false police investigation and fined roughly $1,000, no prison time at all. Many Australians saw that outcome as wildly disproportionate given the emotional devastation and public cost of the search, and the decision drew sharp, sustained criticism in the press. The case set a legal precedent unlike anything Australia had seen before or since. Natasha herself testified, in person, at the trial concerning her own supposed murder, a scenario with essentially no parallel in the country's judicial history. On the stand, she stated flatly that she had never met Leonard Fraser and denied any contact with him or the witnesses who claimed to have placed them together. Once the trial and the media storm around it had passed, Natasha's life took a path that only stoked further controversy. She and Scott stayed together, and after his release from prison, the two married in 2008. Rather than retreating from public attention, Natasha, for a period, leaned into the media interests surrounding her, giving paid interviews and selling her account of events, reportedly for substantial sums. For a public already burned by years of wasted search efforts, this only intensified the backlash against her. Over time, though, the couple settled into something closer to an ordinary life. By 2011, reports indicated they had 3 children together and that Natasha was pursuing further education. The couple eventually withdrew almost entirely from public life, and for years afterward little surfaced about them. What became of her relationship with her parents and brother, so thoroughly shattered by grief and the discovery of the deception underneath it, was never made public. As for Leonard Fraser, he was ultimately convicted for the murders that could actually be proven against him: Beverly Lego, Sylvia Benedetti, and Kira Steinhardt, along with a manslaughter conviction relating to Julie Turner. He received multiple indefinite life sentences and never served them out in full. On January 1, 2007, while incarcerated at Woolston Correctional Centre, he died of a heart attack at Princess Alexandra Hospital in Brisbane at 55. His false confession regarding Natasha's murder remains one of the strangest, most unresolved threads in the entire case. Investigators and true crime writers have never settled on a definitive explanation for why a man already facing multiple life sentences would fabricate in such graphic detail a murder that never happened. It's a question that, to this day, has no confirmed answer. There's one more chapter to this story that the case files from 2003 could never have anticipated. On June 2, 2024, more than 2 decades after she was pulled from that cupboard, police responded to a welfare check at Rockhampton Golf Club, prompted by concerns raised by her own family. There, they found Natasha Ryan dead. She was 40 years old. Authorities determined her death was not suspicious, and a report was prepared for the coroner, though no specific cause was made public. By then, Natasha had reportedly built the ordinary life she once hid to protect, a wife, a mother of 4, and a woman who had gone on to work as a registered nurse. Tributes poured in from people who'd known her not as the girl in the cupboard, but simply as a mother, a sister, a friend. Imagine finding out that for years you had been texting with a dead woman, that every "I'm fine, don't worry" message, every excuse for missing Christmas, every plea for a little more money had actually been typed by the person who killed her. That is exactly what happened in Australia. A discovery that began with a rotting suitcase dumped on the shoulder of a lonely highway and ended by unravelling the deaths of a young mother and her 2-year-old daughter, hidden behind a lie that held for almost 7 years. The most unsettling part isn't even the murders themselves. It's that for nearly a decade, an entire family kept receiving messages from someone they loved, never once suspecting that she had been dead the whole time. Stay until the end, because this is a story about stolen identities, a killer hiding in plain sight, and one of the most disturbing investigations South Australian and New South Wales police have ever pieced together. This is the case of Carly Pearce-Stevenson and her daughter, Candice Pearce. On the afternoon of July 15, 2015, a group of travellers was driving along the Karoonda Highway, a quiet stretch of road running through the Murray-Mallee region of South Australia, not far from the tiny township of Wainarka. As they passed one particular stretch of scrub, something on the roadside caught their attention. A few meters from the asphalt sat an old, weather-beaten suitcase. It looked like it had been sitting out in the elements for a long time. The fabric faded, the zipper straining, partially open, with pieces of clothing spilling out from inside. At a glance, it could have been anything. Luggage that fell off a roof rack, junk someone dumped on their way through, the kind of roadside debris you drive past 100 times without a second thought. But something about it didn't sit right, and the group's curiosity got the better of them. They pulled over to take a closer look. That's when they noticed children's clothing scattered among the contents. And tucked between the fabric, something pale and unfamiliar, something none of them could immediately place. For a moment they debated what they were looking at. A piece of plastic, maybe. The remains of an animal. Nobody wanted to say out loud what they were actually thinking. Unsure of what they'd found, they got back in the car and kept driving. But the unease didn't fade. If anything, it grew heavier with every kilometre. Eventually, they made the call that would change everything. They rang South Australia Police and described exactly what they'd seen on the side of the highway near Wainarka. Officers arrived at the scene shortly after. When they opened the suitcase properly, they found the skeletal remains of a small child. The body had been wrapped in a towel and placed carefully, almost deliberately, inside the luggage, with other items apparently used to conceal it further, as though whoever left it there had gone out of their way to make sure it would never be found, or at least never be identified. Forensic teams began documenting everything on site. Around and inside the suitcase, they recovered several pieces of children's clothing, and one object stood apart from the rest. A hand-stitched patchwork quilt with a black border decorated with colourful musical notes. It wasn't something you'd buy off a shelf. It looked homemade, personal, the kind of thing a family member makes for a child they love. Investigators had no idea yet just how important that quilt would turn out to be. The remains were sent for post-mortem examination. Forensic pathologists determined they belonged to a girl somewhere between 2 and 4 years old. Given the state of decomposition, she had likely been dead for years, and the physical evidence pointed toward a violent death, one that had occurred long before her body was ever placed in that suitcase and left on the highway. That raised a question that felt almost impossible to answer. How does a child that young simply vanish, with no active search, no one looking for her? Investigators immediately began cross-referencing national databases of missing children. Nothing matched. It was as if this little girl had never officially existed at all. In the first days of the investigation, police deliberately withheld several details from the public, the kind of specifics that could later help verify a genuine tip versus a false one. What they did release was the fact that they were trying to determine the identity of a young child found near Winaka, and they appealed directly to the public for help. The investigation grew fast. Specialized units combed the surrounding area, going door to door across nearby towns, speaking with farmers, residents, seasonal workers, anyone who might recognize the clothing found with the child. Nobody could place them. The search widened well beyond South Australia. Detectives combed through medical files, school enrolment records and immunization registries from across the country, looking for any girl whose age matched the estimated range. Images of the clothing were pushed out through newspapers, television broadcasts and websites nationwide. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of calls poured in from people convinced they recognized some detail. Every single lead was investigated, and one after another they were ruled out. Weeks stretched into months without an identity. With no name to attach to her, the media began calling her the Winaka suitcase girl. It was a way to keep her story alive while the investigation continued. But to the detectives working the case, that nickname represented something else entirely. A stalled trail and a little girl still waiting to be named. Then, in early October 2015, something shifted. A woman named Tanya Weber, who lived more than 1,600 kilometers away in Alice Springs, in the Northern Territory, had been quietly following the Winaka case in the news. She called the tip line, not entirely certain of what she was looking at, but with a growing, uncomfortable sense of recognition. Tanya explained that years earlier she had been close friends with a young mother named Carly Pierce Stevenson and Carly's small daughter, though she had lost touch with both of them a long time ago. Still, something about the clothing shown by police looked unnervingly familiar. What really caught her attention was that quilt, the hand-stitched one with the musical note border. Because Tanya knew who had made it, her best friend, a woman named Colleen Povey. And Colleen's granddaughter had been a little girl named Candace. A few days later, Tanya called again. This time she had something far more concrete than a hunch. She had found old photographs of the child, and in one of them the little girl was clutching a Rubik's Cube in her stroller, with that exact quilt tucked in behind her, the same black border, the same colourful musical notes as the one recovered from the suitcase. That was enough for police to open a full inquiry into Carly Pierce Stevenson and her daughter. Investigators began pulling medical files and any official record connected to the child. What they found was chilling in its own quiet way. The girl had received routine health checks and vaccinations during her first year or two of life. Completely normal, completely unremarkable. And then, abruptly, near the end of 2008, every trace of official activity simply stopped. No further medical visits, no school enrollment, no documentation of any kind, as if she had ceased to exist at that exact point in time. Detectives managed to locate a preserved DNA sample taken from the girl at birth and compared it against the remains recovered from the suitcase. The result confirmed what they already suspected. The child, known publicly only as the Winaka Suitcase Girl, finally had a name. Candace Kiara Pierce, born June 19, 2006, in Alice Springs. And now an urgent new question took over the investigation. Where was her mother? Carly Jade Pierce was born on August 7, 1988, in Alice Springs, one of the larger population centres in Australia's Northern Territory. She grew up close to her mother's side of the family and by all accounts was a lively, independent kid. A keen netball player, warm, energetic, the kind of person people describe as impossible not to like. She became a mother while still very young herself, and from everything her family later described, she threw herself into it wholeheartedly. Life wasn't easy. Money was tight, and she was raising Candace largely on her own. But she was determined to build something stable for her daughter, and the two of them were rarely apart. Despite the financial strain, Carly had plans. She wanted steady work, a place of her own, real security for her daughter's future. Her family stayed close and checked in with her often, which is exactly why what happened next felt so wrong to everyone who knew her. Sometime in 2008, Carly decided she wanted to leave Alice Springs and travel, to see more of the country, look for work opportunities, and give her daughter a different kind of life on the road for a while. Nobody who knew Carly was especially shocked by the idea itself. She'd always had an adventurous streak and a habit of making bold, spontaneous decisions. What worried people was who she was going with. In the months leading up to the trip, Carly had started a relationship with a man named Daniel Holdom. Her family barely knew him. The few who had met him described someone guarded, hard to read, evasive whenever conversations turned personal. That discomfort was enough that several family members raised concerns directly with Carly, and some even suggested she make the trip alone, leaving Candace with relatives where she'd be safe and settled while Carly figured things out. Carly wouldn't hear of it. She was certain she could manage everything together with her daughter by her side. In November 2008, Carly, Candace, and Daniel Holdom set out. For the first few weeks, everything appeared normal. Carly kept in touch with friends and family, calls and texts, arriving a little less often than before. Understandable, her family figured, for someone constantly on the move. But slowly, the tone started to shift. The conversations grew shorter. The messages felt strange, clipped, not quite like her. And then, almost without anyone marking the exact moment it happened, the silence set in. Weeks passed with no real news from Carly. When family did manage to reach her, the replies were brief, vague, stripped of the personal details she used to share so freely. The silence became especially glaring around the holidays. Carly had always been close to her family and loved Christmas. But that year, she didn't call to wish anyone a happy holiday, didn't take part in any family celebration. For the people who knew her best, that alone was completely out of character. Investigators would later establish that police had actually stopped Carly and Candace on the Stewart Highway near Coober Pedy on November 8, 2008, one of the last confirmed sightings of them together. Records also placed the group in Charnwood, a suburb of Canberra, later that December, staying for a time with relatives of Daniel Holdom. Witnesses there recalled a serious argument between Carly and Daniel over money. That confrontation would turn out to mark the beginning of the last known chapter of Carly's life. After the argument, Daniel reportedly took Carly out driving that night, saying he wanted to talk things through and calm the situation. Candace was left in the care of others nearby. But when Daniel came back the next day, he came back alone. Asked where Carly was, he told people she had decided to leave on her own, that she didn't want to continue the relationship, and that he had dropped her off somewhere before moving on without her. People had doubts almost immediately. It was hard to believe a mother that devoted to her daughter would simply abandon a 2-year-old overnight and vanish without a trace, without ever reaching out again. After that supposed split, Candace stayed with Daniel. Multiple accounts placed the two of them traveling together over the following days. People who crossed paths with them simply assumed they were looking at a father and daughter on the road. Nobody had any reason to suspect that something horrific had already happened. When police eventually pulled Carly's phone and financial records, the inconsistencies piled up fast. Her phone remained active for a strikingly long time, well into 2011 in fact, sending text messages that reassured family and friends she was alive, doing fine, and notably frequently asking for money. Cell tower data repeatedly placed that phone in the same locations as Daniel Holdham's. It got more disturbing from there. Carly's bank accounts stayed active for years as well. Accessed in at least 4 different states and territories, with more than $90,000 withdrawn over time, some of it through fraudulently claimed government family payments. But when investigators pulled security footage tied to some of those transactions, Carly never once appeared on camera. Daniel Holdham did, over and over. At one point, a woman using a wheelchair was recorded impersonating Carly at a credit union in June 2010, using her identification documents. Separately, another woman impersonated her at a government welfare office in South Australia that same year, presenting identification for both Carly and Candace. What had started as an investigation into a murdered child was rapidly becoming something much bigger. A case that suggested someone had been deliberately impersonating Carly for years, manufacturing the appearance that she was still alive. The question was no longer only what had happened to Candace. It was what had actually happened to her mother. To understand how the investigators eventually answered that question, they had to go back to a completely separate case, one that had begun 5 years before the suitcase was ever found near Winarka. On August 29, 2010, a group of trail bike riders was making their way through Belanglo State Forest in New South Wales. The name alone was enough to put anyone on edge. Belanglo was infamous across Australia as the site of murders committed by a serial killer years earlier, so any suspicious find in that forest triggered an immediate serious response. One rider had drifted slightly from the group when he spotted something odd poking out from the dirt and undergrowth. Getting closer, he realized it looked like a bone. At first, he assumed it was probably an animal. But hours later, something made him go back and look again, and this time he found more scattered fragments nearby. He alerted the authorities. Forensic teams confirmed the remains belonged to a young woman. The body had been there a long time and showed signs of a violent assault before death. With no identification, no personal effects, and an advanced state of decomposition, investigators were left with almost nothing to work from, not even a name for the victim. In the months that followed, they tried every avenue available, analysing the clothing recovered near the remains, releasing information to the press, working with forensic facial reconstruction specialists, and comparing her DNA against missing persons databases both in Australia and internationally. Nothing came back with a match. As the years passed without an identification, the media began calling her the Angel of Belanglo, a name that would follow the case for years. investigators quietly worried they might never learn who she was or how she'd ended up in that forest. For a long time, the Belanglo case and the Winarka case looked like they had nothing to do with each other. But once Candilese's identity was confirmed, detectives decided to test one specific possibility. They compared Candilese's DNA profile against the genetic profile taken years earlier from the unidentified woman found in Belanglo Forest. The result stunned even the investigators who had run the test. There was a direct biological relationship between the two. From that point forward, the case moved quickly. Fresh genetic testing, combined with everything investigators already knew about Carly's disappearance, made it clear. The woman found in Belanglo Forest in 2010 was Carly Pearce Stevenson. Mother and daughter had been dead the entire time. Carly for almost 7 years, Candilese for nearly as long, while someone had spent that entire stretch making sure the world believed at least one of them was still out there, alive. The investigation turned squarely toward Daniel Holdom, the person who stood to benefit most from keeping that illusion alive. And the deeper detectives dug into his history, the more red flags surfaced. Investigators soon discovered that another woman had been impersonating Carly across a string of official transactions. Following that thread led them to Hazel Passmore, a former partner of Daniel Holdom's. At first, Hazel denied any knowledge of the murders. She acknowledged some involvement in the identity fraud, but tried to distance herself from anything more serious. As detectives laid out the mounting evidence they'd built over years of investigation, her account began to fall apart. Eventually, Hazel gave a confession that reshaped the entire case. She admitted to helping maintain the fiction that Carly was still alive, sending messages to family members, handling paperwork and collecting government benefits, all under the identity of a woman who had, in reality, already been murdered. During questioning, Hazel described finding something disturbing among Daniel Holdom's belongings years earlier: photographs of Carly's body after her death. She said the images left her horrified and pushed her to confront him directly. It was during that confrontation, according to her account, that Daniel told her what had happened. Carly, he said, had been killed in December 2008 near Belanglo Forest, following an argument, and her body was left in the forest, where it would remain unidentified for years. In the days after Carly's death, Candilese stayed with Daniel, and then, not long after, she was killed as well. Her body was placed inside a suitcase and left on the roadside near Winarka, where it sat hidden for almost 7 years before a group of travelers finally noticed it. Hazel's cooperation turned out to be critical. It gave police the missing piece they needed to understand exactly how this deception had been sustained for so long. For years, Holdom, along with those who assisted him, had used Carly's bank accounts, claimed welfare payments in her name, and relied on the fact that much of her family still believed, right up until October 2015, that she was alive somewhere out there. On October 28, 2015, 41-year-old Daniel James Holdom was arrested in Cessnock, New South Wales, and charged with Carly's murder. Weeks later, on December 15, 2015, he was arrested again and formally charged with the murder of Candilese as well. What followed was a long, slow-moving legal process that stretched across several years, in part because evidence had to be gathered and coordinated across 5 separate jurisdictions. His trial was scheduled to begin in August 2018. But on July 31, 2018, Daniel Holdom pleaded guilty to both murders instead. That decision spared Carly and Candalyce's family from having to sit through a prolonged trial and relive every detail of the case in open court, though nothing could undo the decade of pain that had already accumulated by that point. When the court's suppression orders were later lifted in September 2018, some of the case's most disturbing details became public for the first time, including the fact that Hold'em had photographed Carly's body afterward. The prosecutor described the killings as a thrill killing, telling the court that both murders fell within the worst possible category of the offence. Carly's father, Bruce Pierce, submitted a written statement during sentencing, expressing how strongly he felt about the severity of the crime. On November 30th, 2018, Justice Robert Hume handed down sentencing in the Supreme Court of New South Wales. He told the court he was satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that Hold'em's culpability was so extreme, and his crimes of such heinousness that no mitigating factor could reduce the sentence that was required. For the murder of Carly Jade Pierce Stevenson, Hold'em was sentenced to life imprisonment. For the murder of Candalyce Kiara Pierce, he received a second sentence of life imprisonment. The judge set no non-parole period, meaning Daniel Hold'em is expected to remain behind bars for the rest of his natural life. For everyone who loved Carly and Candalyce, the sentencing finally closed a search for answers that had dragged on far too long, though for some it came too late. Several relatives died without ever learning the truth of what had happened, having spent years believing Carly was still out there somewhere, that she just needed time, and that one day she'd come back. The remains of both mother and daughter were eventually returned to Alice Springs, and a funeral was held there in December 2015, made possible in part through public donations and support from local government, since the family couldn't have covered it alone. The case also forced a hard look at how easily this had happened in the first place. How a dead woman's identity could be used for years across multiple states to defraud government agencies and manipulate an entire grieving family without anyone catching it in time. Authorities acknowledged that the fraudulent use of Carly's identity had gone unnoticed for far too long, and that stronger checks were needed to prevent something like this from happening again. Today, the case of Carly Pierce Stevenson and her daughter Candalyce remains one of the most disturbing investigations in Australian criminal history. Not only because of the brutality of what happened to them, but because for nearly 7 years, 2 victims went without names, while the person responsible convinced an entire family that one of them was still alive.
Diapers, lots of dirty diapers, baby bottles with maggots in them. It was bad. It was really dark, very hot.
A lot of wax built up in her ears so that we couldn't see her eardrums. She had a hard time keeping her body upright. She had to be supported.
There's no one else here, and they've been at my house all day, and I just figured out that there's babies inside the house. I'm here now.
This is the story of Erica Murray, the woman who lived in that house on St. Paul Street in Blackston, Massachusetts. A town so small the police department stood barely 100 yards from her front door. The story of 2 little girls nobody outside that house knew existed, and of what investigators found tucked inside 2-bedroom closets. The remains of 3 infants, wrapped, diapered, and sealed away. By the time this case reached its conclusion 5 years later, it would divide a courtroom, split public opinion straight down the middle, and leave a Massachusetts judge saying something no one expected to hear from the bench, that nothing about this case was normal and that she could not sentence a woman as though it were. Erica Murray was born to Kevin and Sharon Murray, a middle-class couple in Northbridge, Massachusetts, a quiet town just south of Worcester, and grew up in the very same house her father had grown up in decades earlier. Neighbours remembered her as a cheerful, dark-haired girl with neat pigtails, playing baseball with her two older brothers and splashing in a neighbour's pool in the summer heat, raised in about as ordinary a household as you could imagine. Her father, a diesel mechanic who fixed everything himself. Her mother, a homemaker known for being crafty and good with her hands. By her teenage years, she'd become more conscious of her appearance, always kept her hair and nails done, and picked up a part-time job at the local McDonald's for spending money. And that McDonald's is where everything changed, because that's where she met Raymond Rivera, a man 7 years older than her who would go on to become the father of her children, and who, according to almost everyone who later testified about their relationship, would also become the architect of a slow, methodical isolation that swallowed her entire adult life. At 18, Erica got pregnant, and a former high school friend later remembered that Erica almost skipped her own graduation out of embarrassment before being talked into walking the stage anyway. After graduation, she gave birth to a daughter, Kayla, and for a while, Erica, Raymond and the baby lived with Erica's parents in Northbridge, until a second pregnancy crowded the house, and the family moved into a small home at 23 St. Paul Street in the neighbouring town of Blackston, just shy of the Rhode Island border, where at 21, Erica gave birth to a son, Nick. Family and friends would later say it was right around this move, away from her parents' daily presence, that something in Erica began to shift. The woman who'd always kept herself put together started wearing baggy, shapeless clothes, looked worn down in a way that went beyond ordinary exhaustion, and stopped leaving the house much. And the family, assuming it was simply shame over a messy home, chose not to push her about it. In that silence, things got much worse. Erica became pregnant a third time, then a fourth, then a fifth, and by this point Raymond had made clear he didn't want more children. So she hid every one of those pregnancies under loose clothing and told absolutely no one, not Raymond, not her parents, not her friends, giving birth to all three of those children alone, at night, on the bathroom floor. What happened to those babies would not become public knowledge for years. She would go on to conceal 2 more pregnancies the same way. And whenever Raymond was home, she kept her 2 youngest daughters, the ones who survived, tucked away in second-floor bedrooms out of sight, until her older children eventually realized the girls were living in the house too. At which point Erica simply told them these weren't their sisters, that she was only babysitting. Online, she maintained a completely different life, her social media full of home-cooked meals and proud photos of Kayla and Nick, with no mention anywhere of the 2 daughters she was hiding. She had a genuine creative streak like her mother, selling handcrafted Halloween signs and candle holders out of a small shop in nearby Whittinsville that sold out everything in the 6 weeks it was open, and later took a brief job at a local supermarket before Raymond pressured her into quitting. Raymond himself was working at Staples' corporate headquarters in Framingham and reportedly dealing with his own psychological struggles, and despite everything closing in around her, Erica kept up the outward rituals of a normal life. Walking her kids to the school bus, doing the grocery shopping, even throwing Nick a 10th birthday party with pizza and arcade games, where a neighbour said the couple looked genuinely happy. That same neighbour, A preschool teacher, who was never once allowed past the front porch, said she always caught a whiff of what she assumed was dog waste out there, easily explained away by the family's dogs. And weeks after the last time she saw Erica, everything came apart. On August 28, 2014, neighbour Betsy Brown left her 10-year-old son playing in the driveway with his friend Nick and drove off to run an errand, only to get a panicked call from her son saying he couldn't get a baby to stop crying. Confusing, since, as far as she knew, there was no baby anywhere in that house. She turned the car around and could hear screaming and crying before she'd even gotten out. Nick led her inside, and what Betsy Brown found that day would follow her for the rest of her life. 2 little girls, one about 3 years old and one about 5 months, in separate upstairs bedrooms, both soaked and filthy. The smell so overwhelming she'd later struggle on a witness stand to describe it. Trash everywhere, the floor nowhere to be seen. She called 911, and Blackstone police, whose station sat practically around the corner, arrived within minutes to find the 5-month-old lying on her back in a crib, completely covered in feces, wearing nothing but a soiled diaper, with the body of the family dog dead in the same room. Of the second floor's 3 small bedrooms, one door could only be forced open a few inches, blocked by clutter piled several feet high. And even through that narrow gap, officers could see human feces smeared across the walls. Former Assistant District Attorney John Bradley would later describe the upstairs as being in a state of unimaginable, unsanitary conditions, the 5-month-old looking as though she'd been physically dipped in waste, used diapers stacked nearly a foot high in places, trash and dirty clothing and food packaging covering nearly every floor in the house, along with what looked like a small marijuana grow operation, a potted plant with a UV lamp rigged above it, notable because recreational use was still illegal in Massachusetts in 2014. Around 4 that afternoon, Erica returned home with her 13-year-old daughter Kayla to find a Blackstone patrol officer waiting, and told him she'd left around 10 that morning to run errands. He told her plainly that leaving children that young alone was not acceptable, and she agreed. Soon after, caseworkers from the Massachusetts Department of Children and Families arrived, and that's the moment the stranger, deeper layers of Erica Murray's life began to surface. Witnesses described her, 31 at the time, sitting on the porch steps with a blank, distant expression, hair disheveled, not crying once. And what seemed to worry her most in that moment was that her cat had gotten loose and might not survive the night, when, in truth, that cat had far better odds on the streets of Blackstone than it ever did inside that house with her. DCF workers removed all 4 children, 13-year-old Kayla, 10-year-old Nick, the 3-year-old, and the 5-month-old, pulling them out of a nightmare they'd been forced to call home. In an interview first at the house and then at the nearby police station, Erica admitted the 2 younger girls were, in fact, her biological children with Raymond as their father, and that she'd hidden this from everyone, including Raymond and both older kids, out of shame over having children she believed she couldn't afford. Which is why she'd told Kayla and Nick she was only watching them for someone else. Her account then began contradicting itself. First, she said the girls had been born at Milford Regional Medical Center, and that birth certificates would follow, then later told DCF the girls had actually been born at home and had never once seen a doctor. Blackstone's sanitary inspector, William Walsh, arrived to assess the house and formally condemned it as unfit for human habitation. Before leaving, Erica told him her husband was coming to pick her up, and the last time he saw her, she was walking alone down St. Paul Street. The next day, Animal Control Officer Kevin Sullivan responded to a report of a dog in the basement, found it emaciated, scabbed, and infected with patches of fur missing entirely. And Erica admitted to him she hadn't been able to properly care for either the dog or the cat, which had by then made its way back inside and was in similarly alarming condition. Both animals were seized, treated, and taken to a shelter. The next day, DCF placed the two younger girls into foster care, identified in official records only by the pseudonyms Lisa and Gina, since, as far as anyone could tell, Erica had never actually given either of them a name. On September 3, 2014, the girls were examined at UMass Memorial Medical Center in Worcester by Dr. Heather Forkey and Dr. Peter Sell. Lisa, the older sister, appeared to be about 3. She flinched and drew inward at the doctor's approach, as if bracing to be struck, avoided eye contact, rocked herself to self-soothe, and had matted hair, doughy, underdeveloped muscle tone, and a severe rash consistent with prolonged, infrequent diaper changes, with so much wax built up in her ears that physicians couldn't even see her eardrums. And no speech at all, only low, guttural sounds. Dr. Forkey concluded Lisa had suffered severe, sustained neglect, resulting in genuine developmental delays, suspected she might also be on the autism spectrum, and found her vitamin D and albumin levels low, consistent with malnutrition and a near-total lack of sun exposure, which lined up with the belief that this child had been kept locked in a second-floor bedroom for most of her life. Gina, around 5 months old, made eye contact and even smiled at the doctors, but her muscle tone was similarly underdeveloped. She barely moved on the exam table. The back of her skull was noticeably flattened from lying on her back constantly, and she made almost no sound at all. Findings Dr. Forkey again attributed to severe neglect, though thankfully neither girl showed signs of infection, broken bones, or healed past injuries. When caseworkers later met with Erica and Raymond together, former investigator Catherine Francie testified that Erica appeared emotionally flat and detached, while Raymond was visibly shaken and cried through much of the meeting, with neither parent asking a single question about what would happen to their children. Erica gave the girls' birth dates, but at several points referred to Lisa only as her, never by name, and when asked about a woman named Michelle, admitted Michelle was a fictional persona she'd invented on social media, complete with her own Facebook page, to explain the constant presence of 2 small children in the house. The same story she'd fed her older kids. In mid-September 2014, investigators returned to the St. Paul Street house with a search warrant, this time looking for anything that could establish the younger girl's origins, and found far more than they expected. Inside a closet in one bedroom, State Police Sergeant Pete Egan and his team discovered the skeletal remains of 2 infants, both diapered and dressed in one-piece outfits, one with a full head of hair found tucked inside a backpack, while a second closet in the same room held the remains of a 3rd infant packed inside a cardboard box, this one still attached to a mummified umbilical cord and placenta, pointing toward a stillbirth. Erica was arrested, and investigators reportedly learned that even Raymond had no idea the remains were in the house. She was ultimately charged with second-degree murder in the deaths of the 2 clothed infants that prosecutors believed may have been alive for some period after birth, along with assault and battery causing substantial bodily injury, reckless endangerment, animal cruelty, and concealing the death of a fetus, and held on $1 million bail. Raymond faced 7 charges of his own, including assault and battery, reckless endangerment, animal cruelty, and a charge tied to the marijuana growing operation. Erica's trial opened in Worcester Superior Court in June 2019, nearly 5 years after her arrest, with the case decided entirely by Judge Janet Kenton Walker after Erica waived her right to a jury. Her defense attorney, Keith Halpin, argued there was no evidence she'd done anything criminal to cause any child's death, and that her serious documented mental illness meant prosecutors could never conclusively prove the infants had been born alive at all. Over roughly 2 weeks of testimony, Betsy Brown described through tears the room where she found the first baby. The mattress so soaked in urine and feces it had partially collapsed into a cradle shape. State Trooper Sean Murphy testified about interviewing Erica at Northbridge Police Headquarters, where recordings captured her nervous laughter as her story shifted from having no idea how the remains got there to admitting she'd delivered that baby alone in the bathroom, seen it wasn't breathing and had turned blue, cut the cord and placed it in the closet where her other children slept. Sergeant Egan described clearing a path to the closet and opening the box that held the second and third infants. And forensic examiner Robert Welton testified that one infant was found mummified and wrapped in sweatpants. Decomposition so advanced across all three that determining sex, let alone cause of death, was impossible, with no signs of physical trauma found on any of them. DCF worker Walter McLean described finding the surviving 3-year-old and 5-month-old caked in dried urine, feces and food, including crushed cookies left on the bed, apparently meant for them to eat unassisted. The defense called forensic psychologist Dr. Lisa Rocchio, who described Raymond's behavior toward Erica as a deliberate system built to instill fear and dependence, pressuring her to quit jobs, growing jealous of her contact with friends and family, demanding constant updates on her whereabouts, threatening to leave whenever he was angry, though never physically violent. And forensic psychiatrist Dr. Judith Edersheim, who testified that by the time Erica was pregnant with her youngest children, she was rarely leaving the house at all, controlled financially and verbally to the point of having no independent income or access to family bank accounts for most of the relationship, treated, in Dr. Rocchio's words, more like domestic help than a partner. Dr. Rocchio diagnosed Erica with dependent and avoidant personality disorder, along with significant cognitive impairments in problem-solving, short-term memory, and grasping the consequences of her own actions, testifying that Erica had almost no functional coping skills, tended to freeze rather than act, and when she did act, made short-sighted decisions, like repeatedly hiding pregnancies from a partner who'd made clear he didn't want more children, and that she genuinely did not seem to understand how dangerous the conditions in that house had become, remaining confused even after the details were laid out for her directly. Earlier that month, Judge Kenton Walker had already dropped one of the 2 murder charges for insufficient evidence that a baby had been born alive. And for the remaining count, Halpin argued that Massachusetts law required proof Erica had known a child's life was in danger and had a real chance to save it, a bar, he said, the prosecution never cleared. In the end, the court found Erica not guilty of second-degree murder and acquitted her of reckless endangerment, but convicted her on both counts of assault and battery on a child and on the animal cruelty charges. Calling it a senseless, tragic story about a dysfunctional parent and her family, Judge Kenton Walker added at sentencing, "I have to take into account that the normal does not necessarily apply. There is nothing about this case that is normal," and sentenced Erica to 6 to 8 years, with credit for the nearly 5 years already served, to be carried out at the Western Regional Women's Correctional Center in Chicopee, followed by 5 years of probation, during which she's barred from contact with children under 10. Raymond took a plea deal and was sentenced by the same judge to 4.5 years, with credit for time served since December 2014, plus 2 years and 2 months on the reckless endangerment counts and a 3-year suspended sentence for animal cruelty. Sentences many in Worcester County felt were far too lenient, stirring fresh public outrage among those who believed other states would have punished it more severely. By the story's end, Kayla and Nick were living with their paternal grandparents in another town, a version of stability, with a pool and a basketball hoop in the backyard that had never existed for them on St. Paul Street, while Lisa and Gina remained in foster care. The house itself was torn down, workers in hazmat suits spending days clearing the property of debris and biological contamination before demolition. And while the physical structure is gone, the emotional imprint it left on that small Blackstone neighborhood never really faded. Picture 10 minutes. That's how long it takes to walk 7 blocks in a town where nobody locks their doors. Now picture your daughter walking those 10 minutes on a street she's walked 100 times before, past houses where she knows every dog by name, under a sky that hasn't even finished going dark yet. And picture her never arriving. No scream anyone heard, no struggle anyone saw, no car peeling away, just a girl who steps off a porch at 9:15 on a warm summer night. And a mother who by 9:45 already knows in her stomach that something is wrong before her mind will admit it. For 8 years, investigators had nothing. Not a witness, not a fibre, not one hard lead strong enough to hang a headline on. Then, deep in a forest almost 3 hours from where she vanished, in country so remote that hunters, not detectives, found what was left, the case cracked open in the worst possible way. What turned up there didn't just answer whether she was alive. It rewrote everything anyone thought they understood about that night and who might have been watching all along. Stay until the end, because the detail that finally moved this case from missing to murder isn't the one you're expecting. And the man her own mother now names publicly has never spent a single day in custody for it. This is the case of Lindsay Baum. The afternoon of Friday, June 26, 2009, was passing like any other in McCleary, a small former logging town of about 1,600 people tucked into Grays Harbor County, Washington, the kind of place where a summer evening still smells like cut grass and somebody's barbecue 3 streets over. Taking advantage of summer vacation, 10-year-old Lindsay Baum and her 12-year-old brother Joshua decided to walk to the house of a friend named Michaela, a few blocks away. The route barely took 10 minutes, and it was a path both kids knew by heart. But before they got there, the siblings started arguing over the bike Joshua had brought along. The argument escalated until Joshua turned around and rode home, leaving Lindsay to finish the walk alone. She made it to Michaela's without trouble, and the 2 girls spent several hours playing. As the evening wore on, Lindsay asked her friend's mother if she could sleep over. The woman said no. It was getting late, and she thought Lindsay should head home. A little after 9:15 p.m., Lindsay set out to cover the roughly 5 blocks back to her own house. It was a short, ordinary walk, one she'd made countless times before, along Maple Street between 5th and 6th, in the long daylight of a Pacific Northwest summer evening where the sun barely dips before 10. A neighbor would later report seeing her walking alone right around that time. That sighting is the last confirmed trace of Lindsay Baum anyone has ever come forward with. By her 9:30 curfew, she should have already been home. By 9:45, her mother, Melissa Baum, started to worry. The walk should have taken minutes, and there was no explanation for the delay. Melissa called Michaela's mother first, who confirmed Lindsay had left half an hour earlier. Hoping to cross paths with her daughter, Melissa went out immediately to walk the neighborhood, asking neighbors if they'd seen her, but nobody had an answer. While she searched, Melissa tried calling Lindsay's phone over and over. That's when she discovered Lindsay had left it charging at home before she'd gone out, making it impossible to reach her. It was a small, cruel detail. Lindsay had just gotten that phone as a gift days earlier, one of the things she'd been most excited about, and she almost never left the house without it. Desperate, Melissa retraced the route between the two houses several times, with help from relatives and neighbors. But the girl seemed to have vanished without a trace. As the minutes ticked by, worry turned into panic. Just before 11 p.m., with no explanation for her daughter's disappearance, Melissa called the police. The response from authorities was almost immediate. In a town that small, where many officers personally knew the families involved, the disappearance of a child was something completely outside the norm. Within minutes, officers began walking the nearby streets alongside neighbors and volunteers, convinced Lindsay couldn't have gotten far. Through those first hours, search teams checked yards, alleyways, wooded patches, and drainage ditches, anywhere a child might have gotten hurt or taken shelter. But the further the night went on, the more unsettling the situation became. With the first light of dawn, the search intensified considerably. Dozens of volunteers arrived to help, while tracking dogs, mounted officers, and helicopters joined the operation. What had initially looked like a simple local search transformed into a deployment on a scale almost unheard of for a town the size of McCleary. The FBI was brought in and mobilized its unit specializing in child abductions, setting up a command center to coordinate every search and investigative effort. Over the following days, investigators interviewed neighbors, relatives, and anyone who might have passed through the area that night. They screened registered sex offenders living nearby, checked vehicles seen in the sector, and gathered hundreds of possible leads called in by the public, even setting up roadblocks to identify cars that had come through town around the time Lindsay disappeared. Despite the enormous deployment of resources, the outcome stayed the same. Lindsay seemed to have vanished during a walk of barely 10 minutes. There were no signs of an accident, no signs of a runaway, and absolutely no signs of a struggle. While dozens of officers and volunteers combed the area without turning up a single lead, investigators began reconstructing the missing girl's life, trying to learn whether anyone might have wanted to hurt her or whether anything unusual had happened in the days before. But the more they learned about Lindsay, the harder it became to find an explanation. Lindsay Baum was born on July 7, 1998, in Tennessee. While she was still young, her parents separated after a relationship marked by conflict, and her mother, Melissa, decided to start a new chapter with her 2 kids. In 2007, they moved to McCleary, hoping to find a peaceful place to rebuild their lives and give the children a more stable childhood. Those who knew her described Lindsay as outgoing, chatty, with a striking gift for making friends. Melissa used to say Lindsay seemed to have been born talking, because she always had something to tell or some story to share. She was curious, imaginative, and spent much of her time writing stories and drawing characters. Friends and family remember her as a mama's girl who dreamed of becoming a writer and illustrator, or maybe a veterinarian. She'd scribble stories on restaurant napkins, telling her mother that one day those overflowing shelves of books would have her own name on the spine. But behind that cheerful personality was also a small contradiction. Lindsay had a genuine fear of the dark, and even believed that between midnight and 1 a.m. there existed something like a witching hour, a superstition typical of her age that reflected just how active her imagination was. She hated being out after dark, part of what made her disappearance in the last hour before full night on a June evening feel so wrong to everyone who knew her. As the days passed, the investigation grew until it became one of the largest police deployments that small town had ever experienced. County officers were joined by FBI investigators, child abduction specialists, and dozens of support teams. The local city hall was converted into an operations center, from which searches were coordinated and every incoming piece of information was analyzed. For weeks, teams worked shifts of more than 12 hours trying to reconstruct every minute of the disappearance. Investigators started with the basics, rebuilding the route Lindsay should have walked that night, interviewing neighbors, checking nearby homes, and trying to track down anyone who might have passed through the area between 9 and 10 p.m. None of it got them any closer to Lindsay. As the investigation moved forward, the number of people interviewed kept climbing. Over the following months, investigators conducted more than 1,000 interviews, executed numerous search warrants, and screened registered sex offenders living in the region. Close to 40 people came to be considered persons of interest at different points, and around 40 polygraph tests were administered, but none identified who was responsible. One of the people who most caught investigators' attention was a local jewelry shop owner and volunteer firefighter named Tim Hartman. His shop sat directly on the route Lindsay would have taken home, and surveillance footage later placed him at a nearby convenience store around 9:15 the night she disappeared. Inconsistent statements about his own whereabouts, which he later said were unintentional mix-ups, raised suspicions, and he was questioned for several hours, even agreeing to 2 polygraph tests, both inconclusive. Despite that, searches of his home, shop and vehicle turned up no physical evidence linking him to the case, so he was never formally charged. Hartman would later say he'd actually joined the search for Lindsay that same night, once he'd returned to town from an ambulance call. Meanwhile, Melissa refused to let the case fade from public view. She gave interviews, took part in search campaigns, and kept alive the hope of finding her daughter, even writing a letter addressed to whoever might have taken Lindsay, pleading with them to let her come home. The months turned into years, but the family kept holding on to the possibility that a lead would surface. In February 2014, a brief flicker of hope appeared when a human skull turned up roughly 60 miles from town. For a while, there was fear it might belong to Lindsay, but DNA testing ruled that out. The investigation stalled again, and the case began turning into one of those mysteries that seemed destined never to be solved. For almost 8 years, it stayed without significant breakthroughs, though authorities never stopped working it, still receiving occasional tips. Everything changed in September 2017. Hunters walking through a remote wooded area of Kittitas County, nearly 170 miles, roughly a 3-hour drive from the town where Lindsay vanished, located part of a human skull among the vegetation off Manastash Ridge near Ellensburg. The remains were sent to an FBI laboratory for analysis, while investigators tried to determine whose they were. Months passed without any information going public. Finally, in May 2018, DNA testing confirmed the news the family had spent nearly a decade dreading. The skull belonged to Lindsay Baum. From that moment, the investigation officially stopped being treated as a missing persons case and became a homicide investigation. After years of hoping to find her alive, Melissa received confirmation her daughter would never come home. Following the identification, authorities organized a large-scale operation in the area where the remains had been found. Close to 200 volunteers, officers and specialized teams searched the surrounding terrain over 2 weekends, hoping to locate additional remains or evidence. Investigators never publicly disclosed whether that search recovered anything new, saying only that relevant information would stay confidential. The discovery completely changed the case's direction. Attention no longer centered only on McCleary. It now extended toward Kittitas County too, opening new lines of inquiry and leading agents to take another look at anyone who might have had some connection to that remote area. After nearly a decade without answers, the investigation seemed to regain momentum, even though there was still a long road ahead before anyone could point to a responsible party. Investigators also went back through case files that for years had led nowhere, cross-referencing information from other open cases for any overlap that might explain how Lindsay's remains ended up in that particular spot. That's when several new names moved back to the center of the investigation. One group that caught authorities' attention especially hard was 3 elderly brothers, Charles, Thomas and Edwin Emery. In 2017, they were arrested in a separate investigation connected to possession of child sexual abuse material and other sex offences. During the search of their home, roughly 30 miles from where Lindsay's skull had been found, agents discovered flyers about her disappearance, alongside a large quantity of children's clothing, shoes and toys. The home had belonged to a 4th brother, Donald Emery, who had since died. Investigators also noted the brothers had once been considered persons of interest decades earlier in the unsolved 1988 disappearance of 17-year-old Tracy West from the same general area. Those discoveries pushed investigators to closely examine a possible connection to Lindsay's case. But despite the initial suspicion, no direct connection was ever established. No DNA, no witnesses, no other evidence ever tied them to her disappearance or to where her remains were found, so none of them were ever charged. Investigators later noted the discovery site didn't match the brothers' known pattern, which reportedly involved abusing family members and keeping evidence inside their own home rather than disposing of remains in remote wilderness. Years later, another name surfaced that once again captured investigators' attention: Paul Beaker. In June 2022, he was convicted of the 2003 kidnapping and rape of a 17-year-old girl, a case that had happened in McCleary itself. Finally solved thanks to new DNA genetic genealogy testing. Beaker had been arrested the year before, in June 2021, and was ultimately sentenced to 30 years in prison for first-degree rape, with an aggravating factor of deliberate cruelty. He had lived relatively close to the Baum family back in 2003, and once his DNA connected him to that earlier cold case, some investigators considered certain similarities worth examining between the two crimes, which is how he became a new person of interest. Authorities questioned him and revisited his history, trying to find any element linking him to Lindsay's case. Investigators have stated publicly that Beaker actually passed a polygraph regarding questions about her, and that they haven't found evidence directly connecting him to her disappearance. Even so, just as with earlier suspects, no physical evidence ever surfaced that would allow him to be formally charged in connection with Lindsay's death. Although Melissa has stated publicly that she believes Paul Beaker could be involved, authorities have never filed charges against him in this case, and to this day his possible connection remains nothing more than an unconfirmed line of inquiry. Despite the years that have passed, Lindsay Baum's case officially remains unsolved. Authorities keep the investigation open and maintain there's still a possibility of identifying whoever is responsible. Since the remains were found, the work has continued as a joint effort between local police, the Kittitas County Sheriff's Office and the FBI, all of whom keep reviewing new information as it surfaces. Though much of the ongoing work stays confidential, investigators insist the case has never been closed, and that any lead, no matter how small it might seem, could turn out to be decisive. Given the lack of progress, the Baum family also push forward a parallel investigation of their own, bringing on private investigator Rose Winquist, who has spent years gathering reports, reviewing documents and building an extensive file on possible suspects, working notably without charging the family a cent. As she's explained on different occasions, one of her main goals has always been to locate more of Lindsay's remains, or any evidence that could help reconstruct with precision what happened that night and how she ended up in such a remote area, nearly 3 hours from home. Melissa has never stopped fighting for answers. Over the years, she's taken part in interviews, awareness campaigns and social media posts to keep the case alive. On several occasions, she's stated publicly that she suspects Paul Beaker, while acknowledging it will ultimately be the investigation itself, built on hard evidence, that determines who was truly responsible. In the meantime, she remains convinced someone out there knows the truth, and that sooner or later that person will talk. There's still an active reward, currently standing at up to $40,000, for anyone who provides information leading to the case's resolution. Investigators maintain the same request they've made since the earliest days of the disappearance: that any witness, no matter how insignificant they might think their information is, get in touch with authorities. After all these years, they still believe the missing piece needed to solve the case could be sitting in the testimony of someone who has never yet come forward. For years, McCleary was known as the kind of place where neighbours left their doors unlocked and kids could walk the streets alone without anyone feeling afraid. It took just 10 minutes for that sense of safety to disappear forever. Since then, Lindsay Baum's story has become a reminder that even in the places that seem most peaceful, one person can change the course of an entire community. 17 years later, Lindsay's family still doesn't know exactly what happened that night. The investigation remains open, and investigators insist someone out there knows the truth. Maybe a conversation that once seemed meaningless, a forgotten memory, or a detail never told, is the missing piece needed to identify whoever is responsible. Because until that moment comes, Lindsay Baum won't be remembered only as a girl who disappeared during a 10-minute walk. She'll also be remembered as a family that never stopped searching for answers, and as one of the most unsettling unsolved mysteries in the history of Washington state. Let's hope that someday that story can finally have the resolution her mother has been waiting for through all these years.